Sri Aurobindo is describing is that the mental being faces when it seeks to know the divine and enter the divine consciousness. Two approaches are possible in which we seek to enter into the higher spiritual consciousness, and in the very effort we find that the mind loses itself as you enter into a trance when in identification with the divine consciousness. On the return, the mind is exactly as it was, and therefore there is a necessity for the waking mentality also to be spiritualized. The other approach is that instead of the mind trying to enter into the higher, one invokes the higher into the mind. And this is possible because the mind is primarily an instrument of reflection. And it can reflect that higher if it becomes still. Now, in this discussion so far, already an important idea has been introduced. In the earlier approach of the mind trying to enter into a higher state, the surface consciousness goes into a kind of a trance while the inner consciousness drifts deeper and deeper into the mental, into the spiritual consciousness. Already here there is the requirement for us to recognize that our mind is not just this surface little piece, nor is the full mental consciousness homogeneous. There are layers, there are parts. It is possible for us to withdraw from external activity, but inside the mind can still be active, as for example in dream state. We can quiet that activity and go deeper still, and we would still be on the borderline of our mind's awareness, and it would be a different state. So straight away, there is a recognition that the mind is not one homogeneous whole, is not one flat consciousness. Now this is going to become very important shortly when he discusses the possibility of transformation. So having seen this, we come to the second approach, which is for the mind to call down the divine to itself so that its mentality shall be changed into an image of the divine, shall be divinized or spiritualized. And for this, the primary power is the mind's capacity to reflect. And we saw last time how much in detail Sri Aurobindo has described the steps for this effort, as well as the degrees in which the experience unfolds. The key idea is that in the normal activity of our consciousness, the mind is reflecting the status of mortal nature and the activities of the force which works under conditions of the material universe. That means, you will recall from our discussion last time, there is one gigantic force operating through the entire cosmos. The part of that force working in the material part of the universe, the lowest, grossest, densest, is all that the mind is reflecting. And under the condition of mortal nature, that is, in our biology, the mind is embedded, and so primarily in the biology and through the biology on the material universe, that is all that it is reflecting. But the mind itself could reflect any of these gradations in principle. So the first thing required for the mind to become clear, passive, pure by renunciation of these activities and the characteristic ideas and outlook of mental nature, by this, which we have discussed last time, the mind becomes first like a clear mirror, and like a clear mirror, it can reflect anything depending on where it turns. And then later, the little fragmented piece of mirror gives way to the larger, freer, wider condition of the mind, where it is like clear water reflecting the sky. You will recall our discussion of these two metaphors, clear mirror to still water, and the difference between these, capturing profoundly 2 degrees of the status of a stilled mind. Without ripple, by winds, and the divine is reflected like the sky in the clear water. At this point, what is it that has been achieved? He says, the mind still does not entirely possess the divine. It possesses the divine a little bit. The little bit that reflects, it does possess, but not entirely. And does not become divine, does not entirely possess the divine or become divine, but is possessed by it or by a luminous reflection of it, so long as it remains in this pure passivity. Now, just this is extremely important, and its utility will become more obvious when we look at the next paragraph, where he discusses the requirement for transformation. But here, something extraordinary has been achieved. The mind is a little bit of the divine consciousness. It has not become divine, and yet the divine consciousness possesses it. This is a very big step. You may not have possessed the divine, but the divine can possess you, as long as this stillness continues. Or even if not the divine possessing entirely, at best he says, at the very least, he says, there is this luminous reflection of the divine. And the light itself is of the divine, is the divine, however much reduced, but it is now filling your whole mental awareness. As a result, when the divine possesses your mind, or even a little bit of the divine light possesses your mind, it can begin to do things in you which you could not have done on your own. Remember, in our whole attempt to know the divine, we are struggling with the limitation of the mind itself. The mind may not be able to grasp that, but that can grasp the mind. And if that grasps the mind, it can prepare the mind to overcome its own limitations. It can make the mind evolve beyond its capacity to outgrow its incapacity, awaken to possibilities which right now seem to us not yet, or even impossible. That happening would prepare the way for what we have discussed as what we will discuss as the transformation. So he's not highlighting this aspect yet. It will come obvious later. But for now, this is all we see, reflection. And I'm highlighting this now only so that we don't dismiss this status of reflection as, oh, so what, it's just a reflection. We have to break away from the physical experience of reflection and recognize this as a symbol and enter the experience itself of the mind where it reflects the divine. It is suffused with the light of the divine. Just as when the surface of the lake reflects the sky, the light of the sky is penetrating into the waters. It nourishes the life in the lake. It purifies the life in the lake. Purely to go into the material aspect, the ultraviolet rays of the sun, as they enter the water, they kill the bacteria. They offer nourishment to the plants within so that the plants can grow and through the light, and so on. Setting aside the analogy, here within us, what penetrates is light and substance of the divine consciousness. It can seize on the mind and now begin to mold it. And so this is extremely important, even if we speak of just a reflection. But this is conditional. As long as there is pure passivity, this continues. If it becomes active, it falls back into the disturbance of the mortal nature and reflects that and no longer the divine. So let's say you are in this state of complete passivity. There is a beautiful poise of reflection. And then suddenly someone calls you. Your attention turns and the person says, oh, there's a problem. And immediately your mind's activities begin because the mirror, instead of reflecting the divine, turned now to reflect that activity. And the disturbances of the mortal nature begin to reflect again. For this reason, an absolute quietism and a cessation is the ideal ordinarily proposed. But we are not taking the ordinary path. We're going to the other question. But if you stopped here and said, well, this is my experience, the conclusion you would come to is you have to become more and more inactive. So absolute quietism and a cessation first of all outer action and then of all inner movement is the ideal ordinarily proposed. And we know of many traditions which teach this. Obviously, if you follow such a tradition, you are required gradually to withdraw from life, to reduce the distractions and reduce the compulsions which intervene in this quietism. Obviously, you would tend to withdraw into the forest, or even if you live within the city, you would withdraw from the active life more and more. Here too, for the follower of the path of knowledge, there must be a sort of waking samadhi. Such a person may still remain in a waking state, not necessarily indrawn in deep trance, cutting off from the outer senses. He may maintain the awareness of outer senses, but internally he would be absolutely quiet. And so this is a waking samadhi. Whatever action is unavoidable must be a purely superficial working of the organs of perception and motor action, in which the quiescent mind actually no part, and from which it seeks no result, Now, in this one sentence, he has summarized what normally may take many years of effort. Gradually, bit by bit, you will let go of your personal interests. You will give up all results of your efforts. You will continue mechanically almost whatever is the duty, responsibility given to you. You have no drive of seeking to claim, to take, to have personal profit. All of these impulses within you which bind you to activity and to life, you would let go. And gradually, bit by bit, the quiescent mind is detaching, disengaging from everything. What remains though? You might still be doing your normal routine. There are two activities going on. One is the organs of perception and the motor action. One part is registering, another part is acting, and these go on almost mechanically. I have disengaged from all personal interest or all personal chasing after result or profit. I become quiescent, and this goes on mechanically. And you can see how this would lead to a separation of the consciousness within, which is you, and the rest, which is just a machinery of nature. And a person can live in this poise while fully engaged in all activities of life. They may even run a business involving all the requirements and demands which the business requires. But the person inside will be unmoved, disinterested, at best doing this because it needs to be done, or for the good of humanity, which remains as a general idea, or because it's an offering divine at best. But I withdraws more and more in interest. When something happens, let's say there is a gigantic hurricane which destroys the entire infrastructure of his business, the man will say, oh, and move on. He would not be affected because he has anyway withdrawn so much that there is his personal interest left. And so the whole thing is smashed overnight, and he'll say, oh, and do whatever is required next to be done. You will see an extraordinary equality. While this is not being discussed here, when you look at the formulation of the integral yoga proper in the yoga of self-perfection, it is this equality which Sri Aurobindo makes the foundation for the practice. Now, if you work on the equality, all the benefits of this inner quiescence are there, but without the need to withdraw interest or abandon life. So the poise of equality is superior than the poise of withdrawal of interest. Sri Aurobindo in one of his letters states that yes, vairagya, that is the losing of interest, abandonment of life in disgust, which is very much valued in certain traditions. He says, yes, vairagya can help to turn to spiritual life, but it is a kind of an escapism, and it is a poise of inertia, tamas, because of inability to engage with life. And he says he prefers much more the poise of the Gita, which is that of equality instead of the vairagya. And there you accept the whole domain of life as it is. Yourself being in a poise of equality, you deal with what comes, what goes, with an equal consciousness, which allows you to be engaged fully and without needing to withdraw or run away. And with that equality, automatically within, the benefit of this quietened state is there. But for the moment, we are looking at the obvious conclusion someone would draw and say, well, I need this withdrawal. But this is insufficient for the integral yoga. At best, we can say, you see, the word insufficient is important. It is useful. It is even sometimes necessary, but it is not sufficient for what we seek. And this is the reason why we may recognize in the spiritual journey of a person the importance of periods of withdrawal in which this inner poise can be deepened or the inner experience can be developed and then to re engage. But in itself, the withdrawal is insufficient. Early days, there was a kind of disengagement from the normal life. Not disengagement from life, but from what is called normal life. So the ashram was partially isolated from the rest of the world. And with that isolation, a kind of a barrier was created so that the new consciousness and its values could be developed within to their maximum possibility. Engaging with things outside was avoided, but within the ashram itself, the engagement with life was complete. There were times for withdrawal of a concentrated meditation with the mother or darshan of the mother, in which she would pour down the spiritual consciousness, filling not just the mind but the entire being down to the body, and the times of rest, sleep, or the nap in the afternoon were also treated as periods of an inner withdrawal. And so you can see daily the movement of a partial withdrawal for an inner concentration and then the re engagement with the life. The necessity is there, but it is insufficient for the integral yoga, because for the integral yoga, something more is required. There must be a positive transformation and not merely a negative quiescence of the waking mentality. So, this is one aspect. Quiescence is a necessary condition, but then there must be a transformation, which is the positive aspect of it. And what does it mean, transformation? It means for the mind itself to become different from what it is. And is that even possible? And now he gives you the basis for this idea. The transformation is possible because although the divine planes are above the mental consciousness, and to enter actually into them, we have ordinarily to lose the mental in samadhi. Yet there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper, although modified by the conditions dominant here of mentality. All that belongs to the experience of the divine plane can there be seized, but in the mental way and in a mental form. Now, here is an entire philosophy. If this principle is recognized, then transformation becomes possible. If this principle is ignored, forgotten, or denied, then transformation is impossible. And a divine life on earth is impossible. And so this needs to be understood deeply, although here he has presented the idea in summary form. He develops this idea, gives names to those gradations of the mental planes later on in the yoga of self-perfection. And so, in a sense, right now, as we study this, we can dwell on what these things mean and what is the dynamic of this. He says, There are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality. This is in brief the sentence. So, normally, ordinarily, we have to lose the mental consciousness in order to enter into the divine planes in a condition of samadhi. He uses this word ordinarily. So, what we are required is something not ordinary but more than ordinary, extraordinary. And what is this extraordinary? And what's the difference between extraordinary and ordinary? Ordinary is what is common to the current evolutionary development. Extraordinary is that which is a little beyond the current average development. So, for example, the power of rational thinking was extraordinary at a certain stage of human development when we were still very close to the ape condition of consciousness. Yes, intellect as a power of thought was possible, was even accessed in brief moments of crisis, but it was extraordinary. Over whatever number of thousands or millions of years, we have evolved as an overall humanity to the point where rational thinking is ordinary. Intuitive insight is extraordinary. And yet all of us experience intuition. It comes once in a while, in a flash, unexpectedly. But we cannot call it on demand. You cannot say, I need to know this, so I'm going to sit down and concentrate and get an intuition. Well, at least most people cannot do it. You cannot do it on command the way you can on command think out. If you ask a very developed dog to think, it cannot. But if you place it in a challenging condition where its survival is at stake, the food is now hidden behind some devices which it has to logically understand to overcome. At some point in the stress of crisis, the consciousness will push, cross the border, momentarily touch a rational thought, activate its action, and then fall back. And when repeatedly this happens, the dog actually develops a greater and greater intelligence. Or by contact with human beings. Repeated interaction with human beings where you provoke the rational component. And the result is an infusion of the human mind consciousness into the dog's mind consciousness. And something similar to the divine knowledge, divine consciousness entering us takes place. And its intelligence is pulled up. Its consciousness is pulled up. So, ordinarily, we have to lose the consciousness in samadhi in order to enter the divine planes. Yet, what is extraordinary, what is possible under extraordinary? There are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper. Now, this is a very important idea. In your normal mentality, let's say this is a band of mentality, within here are finer gradations of divine planes of mind, which have similarities to those divine planes above. This is a key idea without which evolution is impossible. You have to look at it. Let's take the example of the dog. In the dog is the gradation of rational mind. In otherwise what is a sense mind or emotional mind, there is a fine gradation of the rational mind. If it did not exist, there was no hope. It is there, but it is undeveloped. How to develop it? Repeatedly exercising it, or by infusing it into you from outside, from someone who's already developed in it. But when that infuses, it activates this layer and makes it more and more full. In the same way, in our mind, including the band of rational mind, there are as if reflections of higher gradations. Maybe if reflection is the wrong word, but representations of the higher planes in finer, diviner planes, but still belonging within the domain of mind. How can we say that? Sri Aurobindo is just saying that this is so. What is the proof? What is the logic even if we don't have proof? What is the logic of such a thing? And I'm going to take to another passage of Sri Aurobindo. This is from one of his last articles. In fact, it is probably the last 3 articles that he wrote, the full set of which is published in the little book, The Supramental Manifestation upon Earth. And here he explains page 93 of this little booklet. If we disregard our present ideas of evolution, all changes. So what is our present idea of evolution? That, well, it is matter which is evolving and developing by phenomena, various appearances of higher consciousness. So if we disregard our present ideas of evolution, all changes. Instead, what should we look at when we look at evolution? If we regard consciousness and not life and form as the fundamental and essential evolutionary principle, and its emergence and full developments of its possibilities as the object of the evolutionary urge. So the normal view of material science focuses on form and the form of life. So the dog is moving around, and as it is going through all its activities, there are nerve impulses, and as a result of complexity of the nerve impulses and the cells of the brain, it develops higher capacity of more complex brain processing, which appears to us like consciousness. So you disregard this. Instead, we regard consciousness as the fundamental evolutionary principle. First of all, there is consciousness. There is no dog, there is consciousness. Consciousness emerges and abilities, and the whole goal of evolution is, the urge of evolution is the development of consciousness. So it is consciousness developing which created the circumstances in order to be able to express itself as dog. Now when you look at the dog, you see consciousness first. Inside the dog is a consciousness trying to push forward its capacities. And this is the reason why, given a challenge, the dog yearns to achieve, yearns to over. The urge is nothing but the urge of consciousness wanting to develop its full possibilities. In other words, within it there are possibilities, not yet full, not yet fully expressed, and it's trying to do that. You look at a newborn human being, and it is amazing how constantly to engage with the world, to learn, to know, to make effort. And one of the most extraordinary events is when the child learns to walk, or tries to walk when unable to. The physical muscles are not strong enough. And yet again and again it will keep doing until eventually they become strong enough from its effort, and then it can walk. Even if the child grew up in the forest with no other human beings, it would have the urge to walk. Where does this urge come from? The consciousness inside knows and wants to be able to walk, and it pushes the machinery of biology and form. So we disregard our present ideas of evolution, we regard consciousness as fundamental and the essential evolutionary principle. To the position of the human being, fully developed to whatever we are capable of now, and turning to the divine consciousness. What is the urge? For this consciousness now to develop that awareness, that capacity. And so what happens next? The inconscience of matter cannot be an insuperable obstacle. Matter cannot stop you anymore. For in this unconscious can be detected an involved consciousness which has to evolve. Life and mind are steps and instruments of that evolution. The purposeful drive and workings of the inconscient material energy are precisely such as we can attribute to the presence of an involved consciousness. So even in so-called dead matter, when there is the evolution of various levels, gradations of elements, or even the complexity of rock developing, it's like an evolution. But it is that same consciousness working in matter, which then develops into life and mind. And then he says, in matter, it is infallible. It's a material instinct. Practically, so I read from there, involved consciousness, automatic, not using thought like the mind, but guided by something like an inherent material instinct, practically infallible in its steps, in all its steps. Not yet cognitive, but miraculously creative. So you see this in matter. It goes mechanically, step by step, and perfectly, no errors. And now you look at the human consciousness up. The entirely and inherently enlightened truth consciousness we attribute to supermind would be the same reality appearing at an ultimate stage of the evolution, finally evolved and no longer wholly involved as in matter. So what you're seeing in matter is that supramental consciousness working in matter, making for all those steps perfectly, without error, practically infallible. It knows what it needs to do and follows its steps. Move to something which is more complex, like the living tissue. You look inside a single cell, amplify it sufficiently, and you find 10,000 different processes going on inside, all of them interdependent, with an extreme complexity. Follow the track of a single molecule of protein and follow its steps. It can go through 20, 30, 40 transformations, involving complex interactions with other molecules and proteins. And if you had to lay out the chart of its processes of transformation, in minute drawing, it would become a gigantic table with all of those steps mapped out. Infallibly, perfectly happening in each of your cells. And if you were conscious of it and tried to mess around with it, you would break it. It does not need your intellect, and yet it has the sophistication of a computer. Perfectly infallible. It is not self-aware. That same process, becoming more and more aware until in our mind it becomes self-aware. And then eventually making that last step until it reveals itself fully for what it is, to be the supramental truth consciousness, infallible in its knowledge, in its power, in its action. The same infallibility you see inside matter, you're seeing now revealed, where there it is concealed. If you look at it like this, the whole thing is one action of the mind, in various degrees of concealment. And so you look at the cosmos now, and all the planes, down to the most material. One single gigantic, all-including conscious awareness, knowing everything, all-powerful in all the details of all activities, universe, perfectly organizing everything in alignment with everything else. From matter all the way to the highest. And if it can be organizing everywhere else, why not here in our mentality also? Its working can begin to reveal more and more. If it can reveal itself inside matter, surely it can reveal itself in a more developed, more conscious awareness. So this is one important point he makes, where consciousness is pushing to evolve. And then we can read the rest of it. It's obvious that eventually it has to come forward. And then a few pages later, he speaks of how this emergence takes place. For throughout the story of evolution, there are two complementary aspects which constitute its action and are necessary to its totality: the action of evolution and the totality of evolution. There is hidden in the involution of nature the secret power and principle of being which lies concealed under the veil cast on it by material nature. And there is carried in that nature itself the inevitable force of the principle compelling the process of emergence, of its inherent powers and characters, the essential features which constitutes its reality. As the evolutionary principle emerges, there are also two constant features of the process of the emergence. There are gradations by which it climbs out of the involution and manifests more and more of its power, its possibilities, the force of its Godhead within it. And there is a constant manifestation of all types and forms of its being, which are the visible, indicative, and efficient embodiment of its essential nature. So, he's describing two things everywhere in evolution. First, there is the secret principle of being which is hidden inside, the pure consciousness holding its possibilities covered up by nature. Nature is like a veil. And then there is in nature itself this principle nudging, pushing, creating forms to express its powers. Next, these two principles, as the evolution proceeds, they also go through levels. The fine essential consciousness is revealing layers, gradations by which it climbs out. It went in by a reverse process of limiting itself, involution, and now it releases or overcomes the veil of nature to reveal more and more. So there are gradations of consciousness. Today I'm more aware, and then tomorrow I'm even more aware, and perhaps a lapse and a rise, but through the fluctuations, I'm stabilizing on higher and higher gradations. Equally on the surface, in the form of nature, with each level that is attained, something changes in the form. Something expresses more. Something in the form represents the power that is awakened in the consciousness. So as inside my consciousness, the consciousness wants to reach out and push its energy to act, to reach out and change my world, it creates in nature an extension, a projection of the energy, and creates a form of projection. That is the arm with the fingers. But you see this emerging at the level of the bacteria. The bacteria is just a little round blob. And a fine thread comes out of the bacteria, which reaches out and creeps towards the food, attaches to the food, and then pulls it slowly in. And if this is the first act of reaching out to engage with the environment, the next act is for these fine tendrils to touch other tendrils or other bacteria. And now instead of grabbing and pulling as food, they express an intention, they communicate. And this is something fascinating we're beginning to observe with more refined tools. When you have a cluster of bacteria, they are bound together by a complex network of such fine tendrils, connecting each other through which they communicate. And so if on one side the bacteria is attacked by heat or some chemical poison, there's a ripple of communication going around to the bacteria on the other end to prepare for this. And if sufficient time is given within that bacteria, the inner consciousness, which is now registering, there is this danger which will break down what I have formed. From the inner consciousness, there's a new reaching out of its force and influence to reshape its material form to make the bacteria immune to the poison coming. And a genetic shift takes place in the form as a result of the exercise of this energy, of the consciousness. And suddenly you have a step further in evolution and in capacity expressed in form. And you look at the genetic structure, you say, this bacteria mutated and became immune to this poison. And this is happening all the time. And so he's pointing out to the potential of the consciousness and then the form following the potential to express it, and a series of gradations. And if the consciousness rises in gradations, the forms go through external changes, visible types, efficient embodiments of this essential nature. There appear in the evolutionary process organized forms and activities of matter, the types of life and the living beings, the types of mind and the thinking beings, the luminosities and greatnesses of the spiritual principle and the spiritual beings, whose nature, character, personality mark the stages of the ascent towards the highest heights of the evolution and the ultimate largest manifestation of what it is in itself and must become by the force of time and the all-revealing spirit. This is the real sense and drive of what we see as evolution. The multiplication and variation of forms is only the means of its process. So he changes the whole perspective of evolution now. It is consciousness pushing forward, expressing through these forms. And the form's development is only the means of this. Each gradation contains the possibility and the certainty of the grades beyond it. So here, as we are in mind, we contain the possibility of the grades beyond the mind and the certainty. Because in the consciousness, that potential is latent, and the whole story of our evolution is that consciousness pushing, pushing, pushing. And that's why we're reading this. That's why we make the efforts that we make in order to grow and to develop in these possibilities. And even if we had not read such things, even if we did not understand, the urge would push and push. Still, the question remains, how do we know that within us those levels are embodied? What is the rationale for this idea? And although we have discussed this before, we may briefly dwell on this again. Look at the universe in terms of the whole, everything together. Where are the levels of consciousness? It's not that in this part one level is there, in that part another level. All gradations of consciousness are everywhere, because there is only one whole. Where is the divine? Everywhere, immanent. Where are all the gradations of consciousness? Everywhere, immanent. So right now here is the physical gradation of substance. There is the life force, the mind substance, and all the gradations beyond, including the Satchidananda. But to a particular grade of consciousness, its grade is more tangible. The other grades are not within its reach. The analogy we give is of the spectrum of radio waves. Right now, through us, literally millions of frequencies of radio waves are passing. We don't register them. because we are transparent to them. They're of a grade that is fine enough. But if you begin to vibrate at the same grade as the radio frequency, it will bump into you, or you will bump into it. This is the idea of resonance. If you take a glass, drinking glass, you've seen those very elegant, beautiful bowls, you touch them lightly with your nails and they make this ping sound. You can speak all you want, the sound goes right through. The glass vibrates a little bit, but the sound passes through, vibrating a little. But if you pick that ping pitch, the exact pitch on which the glass goes ping, and make that ping sound with your mouth, a singer takes that pitch and sings and holds that note. Now what happens? Because the glass naturally vibrates at that frequency, as you sing that note, the glass vibrates more and begins to give off exactly the same note. The two notes collide as if. There is the experience of a force pushing the glass, vibrating, until the vibration grows so much the glass shatters. Now this is a demonstration anybody can make if you have the capacity to hold your pitch exactly. And many professional singers do this as a demonstration of their mastery of pitch. Until you caught that pitch, which is the glass's grade of vibration, the two did not collide. And the same thing is happening to us now. In the part of us, of our body, that is susceptible and sensitive to thought force, that part is our brain and nervous system. In that part, the thoughts in our environment bump and create a slight resonance, like the glass vibrating. And we have a thought, which is passing in the environment. If two of us are tuned to pretty much the same level, and the thought passes, both of us catch the same thought, and we both speak at the same time, what about this? And say, oh, who thought of this first? Neither. The thought came into both of us because we were tuned into that grade. If our thoughts are tuned into higher gradations, then the higher gradations, the higher thoughts will catch more easily. If we tune out of the denser, grosser thoughts, they don't affect us. We see those things, they say, oh, it doesn't interest me. So you can think of the human being now as a musical instrument of many gradations of resonant frequencies. Depending on where you live more, depending on which part within you is more responsive, those kinds of things passing through the universe you pick up. And to the extent that you're unconscious, you act out. So you walk into a space in which, let's say, there is an effort to agitate you in a particular way, and you're susceptible to it, you get sucked. I remember once, for a conference, I was in a hotel, and we saw a board saying that this hotel has a gambling hall. So I went to see what is the gambling hall. There were a few of us, we played the slot machine. But I saw people sitting there, many of them were drinking alcohol. One person had rings with semi-precious stones on each finger. It's like he wanted to maximize his luck by tapping into all the energies possible according to whatever system, astrology or otherwise, that he was following. And the whole tuning was somehow to pull the money. And interestingly, in the background, there was a music going on, of course, fast-paced. And then after a while, I tried to understand what were the words. It was not very clear. And then I caught the wording, and the wording was, I'm losing my senses, I'm losing my senses, I'm losing my senses. I said, aha, this is interesting. It's a kind of a hypnotic influence to encourage you to let go of your common sense, so that you get sucked into the instinct to gamble and spend. Okay, so we were a group. We pulled out some money, we put it in the slot machine. Doesn't work, and then suddenly there was a hit. And we earned maybe 3 times more than what we had put in. And at that point I said, stop. This is it. You should stop and walk out. And the rest of them said, no, we must try a little more, just one more, and they spent it all and they lost. Interesting. If you're conscious, if you keep your rationality and don't lose your common sense, you know, this is it. You were lucky, you got a hit, walk out now. And you make a profit. But if you follow the instinct of the space, the energy is pulling, pushing, and that is where you're resonating more, then one more, it never ends, one more until you've spent it all. And if you look at the human being in this way, as so many levels of resonating centers of consciousness, we are literally like a puppet. Each of these levels is resonating to what comes into it from the universe. They're all among themselves pulling and pushing against each other. Whichever is the stronger impulse at that moment is what we do. And that's it. That's your human being, or the animal human being. Within that, when a small part of the consciousness awakes and steps back and chooses to take charge and lead it, it's a huge step. Because now you have the capacity, in principle, to disengage from this mechanical drive of instincts, to reorganize all your resonant parts, to retune them consciously to higher sources of inspiration. This is what we call refining, culturing, training, etc. So a child, from early childhood, parents will say, oh, this is a bad habit. You must stop now and develop good habits. Later you will find very difficult to change. And this is true. So right in the beginning, as the different layers in your consciousness are forming, you tune them to higher impulses. And the result is, as an adult, your automatic responses are geared and tuned to higher idealistic influences. The same person walks into the space of the gambling. He says, interesting to watch, to see, to perhaps briefly touch, and move on. It does not have the hold. The energy of gambling reaches out, cannot get a foothold on it, and lets you pass. Now, if the same principle could be tuned into our higher gradations, in our mind, where is our mind turned? Here, responding to impulses of our emotions and instincts. You retune to higher things. And that's where satsang, good company, uplifting company, reading higher things, higher ideals, all of these will make a big difference, creating a space in which the whole environment is tuned upwards. But there's something more. The tuning itself can be changed, and this is where the transformation becomes possible. You can make a glass or change the shape of the glass until it tunes to a different frequency. Or you pour water into it to change the pitch of its tuning, and so on. That's where the change of consciousness takes place in us. So, looking at the big picture, we saw everywhere all the gradations of consciousness are there, but a grade responds to another grade according to its similarity of tuning. So matter bumps into matter, thought passes through matter. But within matter itself, in that gradation, everything else is there. Not so far fully expressed. But it's there, and if it's there, it pushes. And maybe it's not a very strong push, the influence is weak, but over a few million years, it can push sufficiently that it awakes that finer gradation in matter. And we will say matter has evolved. It is now resonating to higher frequencies. Same in the life. That's how life emerges out of matter, and mind emerges out of life and matter. So in our mind, which has so evolved now, the mind was originally just a tiny influence on matter. until it developed and made matter grow to become sufficiently capable. And so, in the form of our biology, it developed the sensational response to thought. You allow that fine grade to reactivate, and you find yourself becoming conscious. Literally, the thought consciousness or the mind awareness, which is infused with the gross body, has this very fine interface of matter with which it connects. You remove that interface, and the thought body drifts off. Material body falls unconscious or dead. That's all there is to it. There's this fine grade of interface in the material substance. And even in the material substance, there are parts which may perhaps be further evolved to tap into still higher grades. We find, for example, in certain animals, certain birds, a sensitivity to magnetic fields. They can sense magnetic fields. They can even see magnetic fields. How? Well, these finer gradations have put forward their power to act, to engage with the universe. In our mind now, finer gradations of the higher consciousness are also there. Small nudging influences, very fine, subtle. But if you make your mind very quiet and tune in consciously in your awareness, in thought, to those gradations, then they begin to act more. You can activate their contact with your mind awareness. You can activate their influence in your mind awareness, and they can begin to develop their organs in the mind substance. Exactly the same thing which has happened in your biology over millions of years, except that this thing can take place within weeks, months, years. And the organs in the mind develop just as the power of the intellect and logical thinking has developed in your childhood, in your teenage, through action, through engagement. So to these higher gradations of the finer, diviner states influencing the mind, they can act because they're right there. They can act and become more active, more organized, and create their own organs until they're so well organized that they become the link to that higher consciousness, or they become its operation in your mind. Just as in the physical body, thought has its operation and life force has its operation. And when you think about the whole thing in this way, everything being in everything else, and it's only a question of emergence of what is already there, it's obvious. Yes, we can say there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper, although modified by the conditions dominant here of our mentality. So, those planes working in this domain are necessarily subject to this domain. Just as in the biology, the mind and life working in the biology are subject to biology. That's why your brain is dependent on oxygen level in your blood. It's dependent on the inertia, which is characteristic of the biology. But still, it can sufficiently develop to even will itself to overcome the inertia and even the oxygen lack of oxygen. So in this way, the higher planes having their principles here in the mind, developing, creating their own finer gradations. They exist already. So there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, into which we have not yet consciously risen or developed the possibility of experience. And they reproduce those higher principles here with this modification. Now, let's take a practical example. At the level of the sense mind, and the emotional mind in the animal, the supermind is actually represented as but modified and greatly reduced to the capacity or the nature of the sense or emotional mind. When it begins to come forward and act, it's not supermind proper. It is only its equivalent principle operating here on this grade. When it comes forward, what does it do? What will supermind do? Put everything in perfect alignment, harmony, order. So what happens in your normal emotional, sensational mind? Though this provokes fear, that provokes attraction, that provokes jealousy, this provokes anger, this provokes happiness, this provokes excitement. All of these are simultaneous through the senses and in the emotions. A person will say, I am so fed up with this. And in the next breath say, oh, I'm so fond of this. Because at the same time, different emotions and sentiments and sensations can coexist. As this principle comes forward, it falls into place. And suddenly, I don't like this and I like this are put in place. I like this because I have a craving for it. I don't like it because I feel it binds and limits me. You can see how that happens to, let's say, an addict, a smoker. He says, I can't help it. I need this. I like it. On the other side, in his higher parts, he says, no, but this is something which limits, dulls, reduces my quality of life. I refuse it. But there are different levels and they're placed in order. So when this principle of the intellect comes forward more and more, it's actually the supermind acting on this level. It organizes, places thoughts in relation to each other. And suddenly, all the thoughts are seen in a hierarchy. There are larger, inclusive thoughts, and there are smaller, fragmented pieces, and they all fall in a neat, ordered structure. Sri Aurobindo uses this phrase like phalanx, like people, like soldiers in straight lines, neatly organized. The inferior thoughts below, superior, inclusive thoughts above, and the same with your emotions and sentiments. And this is what logic does. It now stands back, sees all this, and they fall into order. It does not have to pick them and arrange them. Just the act of seeing, being aware, knowing where they are where they are, but they fall in order. And this is the action of the supramental principle, or rather its representation in the sense mind and emotional mind. Now that growing into its own can actively arrange. Now it says, I don't want these thoughts, I refuse them. I don't like these emotions, I change them. And it starts taking an active position and organizing the quality of thought and the habit of your mind, levels, gradations, detuning from lower impulses and retuning to higher impulses. And the result is a finely developed, richly expressive, rational mind. Who is the center of it? The power of the supermind, now operating in this level. Now the same thing, that same power operates in many degrees. So this mind now, richly developed rational mind, becomes very quiet and turns towards the higher spiritual ranges of the infinite supermind. It cannot know it except by going into trance. And yet its principle is still operative here, now in that poise of silence, when it comes forward, more revealed, more truly reflective of that power. What does it bring? Spontaneous knowledge, infallible knowledge, but in a burst. Because the mind is still capable of reflecting only a little bit, a piece of the sky, not the whole of the sky. So a piece, a flash, and it is not able to hold its steadiness perfectly. So the moment there is a flash of revelation, the mind agitates. Oh, here is something. And it breaks. So it comes, flash, and mind becomes agitated. It catches, starts processing. So you train it. not to agitate and stay still. Still, the flash is too much at first. The nature of the mind is to turn into form. The moment there is an insight of knowledge, rather than continuing to see as in insight, it turns to form of thought for which it must be active. And so it loses that poise. But still, a beginning is made. A higher grade corresponding to that divine consciousness is now operative. And if the rest of the mind, your rational self-awareness, says, I consciously choose to develop this, it can speed up the whole process, which normally would take 1,000,000 years, and it would happen in a few months, weeks. So when we think of it in this way, you realize right now in our mentality, everything is present, all the levels, including the lower gradations, and as subordinate principles of the mind's awareness. So this is the reason why in the big picture we will say the universe is organized with 7 principles. Each of those principles is as if a world in itself, but within each principles, all others are present, so they become like finer gradations. In matter, you have finer gradations. In life force, you have finer gradations. In mind, you have finer gradations. How many? Well, 7. Within each of those, again, all 7 exist. Within each of those, again, all 7 exist. How far can you go in this fine subdivision? Unendingly. But that's how the mind is seeing what is otherwise a very simple truth. Everything is simultaneously present everywhere. If you look at it this way, you don't need to cut up into pieces. But for the mind, in its sensory experience, it has to say, this makes for 7 worlds, within which there are 7 worlds, within which there are 7 worlds, within which unendingly. You see, it is mind that needs to divide in order to be able to grasp and say, now I understand. But if you step back and with a very quiet mind look at this, everything is in everything else, and it must emerge. The divine is concealed, it must come forward and reveal itself fully. Very simple, really. Except because we're still dealing with it through the mind, we have blurred out the fine distinctions and layers. But in a higher way of knowing, you would see oneness with all the fine interactions of all the gradations pushing forward at each step, revealing. So, in brief, just as in the physical consciousness, there are 7 gradations, within each of which there are 7 gradations, within each of which there are 7 gradations of matter, each representing a finer combination of the consciousness levels, so too in the mind are 7 gradations. There is a part which turns towards physical matter. There's the part of the mind which is turning to the drive of impulses, of energies. So the physical turn of the matter is the part of the mind which embeds into the body and through the body looks at the world. We will call it the sense mind. There's the part of the mind turns to energy impulses and reaching out to connections. We will call it the dynamic or emotional part of the mind, which wants to reach out, do things, arrange, act. And there's the mind which looks at mind as itself, a mental mind. And when it thinks, it doesn't have to worry about the sensory reality of the world. It asks, where did I come from? Why am I here? What do I really want to do if I exist at all? So that kind of an abstract thought is its preoccupation. But it has no answer. Because in itself can keep on going round and round, proving and disproving unendingly. It must turn to something against which it will hold reference. So if it turns down, it sees material world exists. Whether I like it or not, I get a blow on my nose if I ignore the reality. So it exists, and I serve now to organize my physical reality. Or it turns up, glimpses a higher possibility and says, there is also this extraordinary spiritual world, and I can serve that. It must serve something if it must feel fulfilled. Otherwise, by itself, it becomes agnostic. I can prove nothing, I can be sure of nothing. And so when it turns up, that's when we have the beginning of a spiritual quest or life. And then there is a finer gradation above this, which is the representation of the supermind here in your dividing mind. That layer we will call the intuitive consciousness. It knows, like the supramental, perfectly, infallibly, but because it is working inside domain of mind, it sees and knows in pieces. So it can know infallibly a patch of light which is illumined, but it knows also its limits. It is infallible to the extent that it knows its own limits and knows that it does not know beyond this point. Within what it knows well, perfectly. But the infallibility of a patch, when put in context of a larger knowledge, this could appear to be erroneous. But it would know that there is something missing. And this is the saving point, saving grace. So the awakening of the intuition is the first step of the spiritual domains of consciousness inside our mind. And then still above that, there will be finer gradations. Even if we recognize that, yes, from our rational mind to the intuitive mind, we have to make a step, immediately we would see, but there will be finer gradations in between, isn't it? And we can map those. And Sri Aurobindo does map them. So in the same text, which we digressed to from the supramental manifestation, he's describing what happens as this grows. So he's describing now top down. There is an increasing self-limitation which begins even with overmind. Overmind is separated by only a luminous border on the full light and power of the supramental truth. And it still commands direct access to all that supermind can give it. There is a further limitation or change of characteristic action at each step downwards, from overmind to intuition, from intuition to illumined mind, from illumined mind to what I have called the higher mind. The mind of light is a transitional passage by which we can pass from supermind and superhumanity to an illumined humanity. For the new humanity will be capable of at least a partly divinized way of seeing and living, because it will live in the light and in knowledge and not in the obscuration of the ignorance. Now this he is describing because with each level of consciousness, remember what we read earlier, there is a change in form. And you see that in the plants and animals, each time there was a shift of a new power, form has to change to express the power. But in the human being, the form is sufficiently developed that all the higher gradations can be expressed without needing to change physical form. But form of mind will change. The psychological form changes. Your way of thinking changes completely with each gradation of consciousness emerging. And so he speaks of a superhumanity, which is now living in a consciousness of light. Transitioning from the higher mind to the illumined mind. In between this is a fine grade. When that becomes active, that can provide the basis for an action of the truth consciousness in the mind. And that would be what he is describing here as a superhumanity. This is within our reach as we are today, evolved. If we focus on this grade of consciousness and allow its emergence fully, if we let it organize itself more and more, of course, under the pressure of that higher consciousness. So here comes the interesting point. If in every plane, in every grade of consciousness, all the principles are represented, as that principle becomes active, it resonates, like the resonance of the sound we discussed earlier, with the plane proper of its principle. And so as the intellect within the emotional mind begins to organize itself, its awakening resonates with the truth consciousness of the supermind, and it assists lifting and developing its full possibility here. In the same way, as our irrational mind becomes quiet and turns to a higher mind, illumined mind, or an intuitive consciousness, those planes which are already existent in the universe, they now begin to engage more and more directly and begin to assist in this development. All of this can be seen almost as an automatic process. Because it's there, it will interact and assist. But there's something more which is possible, which is beyond the automatic. When you turn to the divine, and the divine as conscious being, consciousness, he is present everywhere. His power is present everywhere. And you consciously engage with the divine and consciously submit and open yourself and invite the divine action. There can be an active engagement from above, pouring into you, working inside you, reshaping, forming, and transforming. And this is what the mother was doing when she would bless. To the extent that your consciousness can open, she can consciously enter and begin to shape and change things. The result now is a little bit like the human being now interacting with the dog to assist the awakening of its intellect, but much more powerfully. Because our intellect is not able directly to enter the dog. It is only an indirect influence of repeated contact and an unconscious intermingling of energy. But the spiritual being is conscious inside out. She looks at you and knows you from inside out. She is identified within your consciousness. She is in your consciousness and can pour her transforming energy inside you and from inside reshape. And to the extent that you allow, by your self-giving, the reshaping can become faster. To the extent that you are unable to give yourself, the reshaping is that much slower because against resistance. To the extent that you are closed, the reshaping is not possible, but a preparation for reshaping is there, which is the light preparing and helping you to open and surrender. Now, all of this, her consciousness sees you like an X-ray because it sees everything, because it is one with everything. And then depending on your active or passive engagement, she pours in you on all levels. It's a very interesting comment made by Vasishtha Ganapati Muni. He was a very great yogi, one of the extraordinary rishis of the modern age. When he came and met with the mother, he's the one who recognized Ramana Maharshi as a great sage and gave him the name Maharshi. When he came and met the mother, he sat in meditation with her, and she commented later that she had never gone so deep in anybody before. Without resistance, she could go straight deep into him all the way through. He was completely open and awake to receive her. And another comment she made, because he was coming to the meditation hall for the meditations, for the meditation with the mother, he said, whenever he comes, the hostile forces run away. Such is the intensity of his tapas. When he was asked what was his experience, he said, first he said, normally I feel the light entering me from above, but meditating with the mother, the light was entering him from all sides. And second thing he said, he had this intuition of her as, he used the word Shakambari, which is an aspect of the Divine Mother, and himself knowing himself as her child. And Mother said simply, it is more than an intuition. But this experience that the light was coming from all directions, penetrating from everywhere, is the action of the divine force, of the Mother's force. We may not be receptive on all levels, and so we receive only or experience or register only in those parts where we are more conscious or receptive. But because she penetrates everywhere, her action is also on all levels, preparing and eventually transforming. So the whole process of the yoga undergoes an enormous shift when we engage in this way, all of which is described in great detail in the later portions of the synthesis of yoga, when it discusses the integral yoga proper, and the divine Shakti is an entire chapter, and the action of the divine Shakti is another chapter. But here we are only looking at the principle, and the principle is this: the transformation is possible because there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper, although modified by the conditions dominant here of our mentality. So the intellect developing within us is only a representation of the supramental principle here operating in the sense and emotional mind. In our higher powers of the mind, rational thinking mind, again, when it opens, the supramental principle is operative as the intuitive grade of consciousness. And that is not part of our ordinary mind, not part of our normal mentality. It is superior to our normal mentality. And therefore, the first condition to open to a higher grade than normal is the normal has to become quiet. So silencing the mind, Sri Aurobindo describes as the first step needed. And the second step, he says, is to shift the center of thought higher up, because the natural center of this intuitive mind is above the natural center of the thinking rational mind. So shifting the center of thought in the subtle body brings it closer to that center and helps its activation to happen. All that belongs to the experience of the divine plane can there be seized, but in the mental way and in a mental form. So what would be the normal experience of the supramental consciousness is available in the intuitive consciousness in the mental way and in a mental form. Meaning, in the intuitive consciousness, you will still have the knowledge as in a mental knowledge. And in a mental form, it will tend to take on a form of thought. But you could still train yourself to not just have the intuitive consciousness as a link in between, to bring into your thinking mind an insight. You could train yourself to shift into the intuitive consciousness. And there will begin another level of opening to higher possibilities. So you see, two things are happening. This higher plane, which is in the mind, can be like a link to allow something of that power to operate in the mental way, in the mental form. Or you can shift a grade, now that this is available. It becomes a power to shift your center of consciousness. And then you can receive on a higher grade. And then from there, something more is possible. To these planes of divine mentality, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state, because they belong to the domain of the mind. In the waking state, you're able to shift yourself to live in a more intuitivized consciousness. Or it is possible for him to derive from them a stream of influences and experiences which shall eventually open to them and transform into their nature his whole waking experience, existence. So this is the second possibility. You can live in that intuitive consciousness in a waking state. Or you have your normal mentality. This becomes like a source through which there is a streaming of influence and experience. So every time I have a problem, I become quiet and I wait and flash. There's an intuition. Or even when I'm not seeking it, I meet somebody and flash, there's an intuition. Oh, this person has just had this particular problem. Where did this knowledge come from? Just there, it flashed. It's like a mirror reflecting. And one can have access to all kinds of knowledge. It's as if after a while things become transparent. Circumstances become transparent. A situation comes up and you see the layers behind What are the influences which are causing the situation, and so on. So this kind of a streaming comes from the intuitive consciousness, for example. What happens by the streaming? Eventually, which shall eventually open to them and transform into their nature, his whole waking existence. If from high grade now flash, 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 the stream comes, it forms a continuity of consciousness. And at that point, when the continuity exists, I here turn to know what is that part revealing to me. And it's available because there's a continuity. I can receive the intuition at will, but still register in my thinking mental way. So this is what happens to a practiced musician, artist, or writer. They sit down to write their poetry, for example, and they tune in and the intuition begins to flow. They're given a subject, they tune in and the intuition flows. If you've seen comedians, professional comedians, they're given very difficult challenges. Use this particular word in that particular situation and make it out as a skit. And the person comes with something so extraordinarily creative that you find the audience laughing, not just because of the quality of the humor, but because of a surprise, an element of surprise. And that's happening because of the intuition. If the intuition was not there, you could not do something like this. You cannot think it out. You cannot go through a mass of a million possibilities, especially when the things don't match. You're given a word and a situation which has no connection. I remember it was in South Korea. I was with a group of religious leaders and we were taken to a fashion show. And the fashion show was done for the purpose of anti-war protest. What's the connection between fashion and war? Think about it. And then I was asked to speak at the opening ceremony of the fashion show. Now, war, fashion, and we are coming from a spiritual background. They all know that. That's why they've asked us to come there and speak. War, fashion, spirituality. How are you going to connect it? You can't think it out. I said simply, fashion is not doing things just because you want to change. True fashion is an expression of what is within you. You feel happy and you create an expression which expresses your happiness. You feel the blues, well, you create an expression of form of dress which is expressive of what is within you. So true fashion is an expression of your inner being. War and peace also is an expression of your inner being. As long as within you there's a conflict, you will have war outside. When you are at peace within you, you will have peace outside. And so fashion is an expression of the inner consciousness, as is the circumstance of life and war and peace. And we must therefore develop the poise of peace, find the peace and unity within us, with all humanity, and then we will be able to express in fashion, in life, and in our circumstances with people and nations, this joy and beauty and love which is natural to the divine consciousness within us. Something along those lines. But you see, there's a thread which links all three coherently. And my group was very surprised. They said, we could never have imagined something like that. But there's an insight which comes flash and you can see the link. And once you express it, yeah, it seems so obvious, it seems so simple. But when you do that in a challenging circumstance, as you can see in the performances by comedians, it's astounding some of the things that come up and the insights. In the Indian tradition, we had this Ashtavadhanam, the power of the mind to do 8 different things at the same time, involving all kinds of activities, playing a game of chess, composing poetry, 1 letter at a time, and one of 8 things. So in the poetry you're composing 1 letter at a time. Each time you speak 1 letter, the opponent can tell you what letter you may not use next. So you're actually forming a line of thought. He breaks it each time, a new letter, which he would guess what you might want to say. And you have to actually navigate at each step opposed to complete a verse with a rhyme, with rhythm, and with a deep spiritual insight. Can you imagine the genius required? And the only way you can do this, because you cannot know what the fellow will oppose, what letter he will prevent you. You cannot pre-plan, and it goes into millions of combinations. Your mind cannot handle it. Maybe you can handle it. So there was a Ashtavadhanam who had done a demonstration here, and I was the secret of this extraordinary power of the mind. And I went to him and said, well, what is the secret? What do you do? And he was very quiet. And he said, you become very quiet inside. You remain in complete silence. I said, no, there's something more you do. Do you do like breathing exercises or some pranayam to amplify your brain power or something? No, just become very quiet. Of course, later I understood that the whole thing was very different. But the internal stillness is the condition for reflecting the intuitive consciousness, for its activation within you. And when you're like that, you're not thinking out, you're not thinking, you're not colliding with the challenges. You're just like that, and plop, 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 the intuition goes step by step. And that's the only way you can manage it. So the idea here is any activity in life, if you're going to do something unusual, involving an unusual insight which the mind couldn't have thought out, it's happening because of the intuition. And these people have trained themselves to do it at will. The comedian is switching it on, literally it's there. And he can do it whenever he wants. So what's happening here? Your active mind has created a channel to the intuitive level of consciousness. You're not living in intuition, but you have access to it at will. Same with the musician. Playing a piece of music, through the years he's developed this link. And you'll see when they're playing the music, they're a different person. Once the music is off, they're back to their normal, habitual mind turning to their senses and desires. It's a different person altogether. You see them preparing for the music, it's like the breakaway shift and the whole mirror turns up and there's a light and a glow in their consciousness, and the whole thing happens after that spontaneously. To the extent that you're able to turn that, your performance is successful. To the extent that you were not able to turn to it and open to the link, it was not so good. And so what happens? A stream of influences and experiences which he derives from those levels. And then what happens when the stream continues? Which shall eventually open to them and transform into their nature his whole waking existence. So when this is happening in a streaming way, at some point your consciousness stays open to that. At some point, something begins to shift. You are more and more in that. And so there is an opening to the higher consciousness, and then there is a transformation into their nature. Those things now begin to govern more and more your whole thing. So think of it this way, two planes, two gradations, separated by a gap, so no connection. Now thin link forms and there's more and more of the streaming. The thin link widens, becomes more and more constant in all activities of life, until eventually the higher grade and the lower grade are fully bridged. And that begins to govern. Transform into their nature his whole waking existence. These higher mental states are the immediate source, the large actual instruments, the inner stations of his perfection. Now this one sentence is going to take us an hour of discussion if we fully appreciate what he's saying here. But for now we make a quick summary of what is here, and maybe we'll look at it in greater detail next time. These higher mental states, and there are many such. We were speaking of intuition as only one. are the immediate sources of the mind's perfection, of the human perfection, the large actual instruments of our perfection, and the inner stations of our perfection. These three terms describe three different relationships. But through all three relationships, this is what gives perfection to the mind or our life or our consciousness. So these are the immediate sources. So practically all the examples I described earlier, the source of the intuition, the source of the knowledge, the source of the music, the poetry, the dance form, whatever it was, which broke barriers, expressed something new, this was the source, the immediate source, not the eventual source. The eventual source is always the supermind. This is the link point through which we can say, I received this new flash. Close this link point. If you have your mobile phone, you make a phone call. It is from the mobile phone. If you have a mobile phone and you make a phone call, the connection is going all the way, let's say, to the other side of the world. It's bouncing through satellites, going through undersea cables, all kinds of links. But the immediate source of the communication is the nearest transmitting tower. In between, you have nothing else. Okay, so the immediate source is this sense. This is the link point through which all the divine possibilities, the whole perfection of the divine consciousness comes to you. So these higher mental states are the immediate sources of our perfection. Second, they are the large actual instruments of the perfection. Our temporal or superficial instruments are my body, my speech, my tongue which spoke out, my hand which wrote the poetry. But the actual instrument is not the tongue. The tongue is only the actual instrument is the thing which thought out, gave form to the poetry, and which looked at the full scope of the poetry. So I took the example earlier of the Ashtavadhanam, who's composing poetry one letter at a time. The large scope of possibilities with each letter is so huge, managed with your mind. But there is a mind or a state of consciousness that sees the whole. And out of that, it picks out something immediately in front. So the large actual instrument is that, of which these, including mind, are the transcribing secondary instruments. You can say, oh, my hand wrote the wonderful poetry. No, it's not true. My mind composed the poetry. No, it's not true. My mind received the poetry which was composed there, or rather seen there. That was the large actual instrument that had to be large in order to see the full scope to fit into this challenging circumstance. And then the third phrase he has put, the inner stations of his perfection. And within us are the stations which make for the perfection of our life, of our consciousness. And these are the inner stations. But he is not going to use one word, station. He has put a footnote there against the word station. In the footnote he writes, station, called in the Veda variously seats, houses, placings or statuses, footings, earths, dwelling places. Sadas, Griha or Kshaya, Dhama, Padam, Bhumi, Kshiti. 6 terms he gives from the Veda with their English equivalents, all of which terms are now replaced by one word, the inner stations of his perfection. And now you can see we have to dwell upon each of these 6 terms and see what they mean, what they represent in our consciousness experientially. And so that we will be discussing next time. And the next class, and hereafter all subsequent classes, we will, of the Friday class only of the synthesis of yoga, we will be having at Savitri Bhavan. Originally, these classes were started at Savitri Bhavan about 17 years ago, I think. And in between, we had shifted here. And so we will be shifting them back from next Friday onwards. And for those who are coming from Pondicherry, we will have a van which will leave from here at 4 o'clock. So we will leave, you can be here a few minutes before. We will leave at 4 and we will come back from there after the class. Generally, it takes us about half an hour to get there and to come back. And the session itself will be in the hall, Sangam Hall in Savitri Bhavan. For those who are following it on the webcast, it will be webcast from there also live at the same time with the same arrangement. So we can pause here for now and look back at the big picture. Quieting the mind to reflect is not, he says, is insufficient. There must be a positive transformation. And the positive transformation is possible, he says, because there are in the mental being divine planes superior to our normal mentality, which reproduce the conditions of the divine plane proper. And to these planes, it is possible for the developed human being to arise in the waking state and to derive from them a stream of influences and experiences through which eventually the human being can open to those planes and even transform the whole of the nature in the waking existence to those levels. And always, even when we are not conscious, it is these planes which are the immediate sources, the large actual instruments and the inner stations of our perfection. This in sum is what we have covered today. We can take up any comments or questions. What Sri Aurobindo does is very rationally and very convincingly and experientially is that we are too rationalized and reduced to the sense mind and the material logic. So there is a natural tendency of skepticism to things which are not part of the obvious physical experience. So things of the subtle and spiritual, oh yeah, someone says it, but is it true? That doubt comes. And this can only be countered by logic. So rationally, when you see, yes, this makes a lot of sense, it fits my physical evidence of evolution, that satisfies the rational mind. But that's not enough. We still have the next filter, which is our heart. Do I feel comfortable with it? If you tell me that one day I will fly, oh yes, I would love to, but I know that's not possible intuitively, right? So it has to resonate with a deeper heart's intuition, which says, yes, this is true. This makes sense. And then finally, on a deeper level, something has to touch the experience and say, yes, this is so. So Sri Aurobindo addresses all three levels. We could stop superficially and say, yes, this is what we have studied and understood. But no, at the same time, our hearts have been awakened. We feel the truth of it and we seek it. We want it. We want to realize this. We are drawn to, an aspiration is awakened in our heart. And there's a third layer behind this, where actually we touch something of the experience in a very refined, quiet part. And if we become very quiet and read it with that quiet state of reflecting the experience that he's describing, then something in us begins actually to feel by reflection, yes, it is so. Yes, it is there. Yes, this is true. Yes, one becomes this more and more. And you're pulled into the experience. The experience begins to form in you. So observe all three. and allow them to grow. And then we can find this as not only a text, even a practical guidance which leads you.
Questions. Moment of light. Start already into higher mind, reasoning mind, mind towards later. And even though she created that mind, it wasn't there before.
Yes.
Is that what she's talking about?
Yes. So the question is the mind of light in part of these gradations of the mind? And second, we have heard from the mother that Sri Aurobindo created the mind of light. It didn't exist before. Is this what he is talking about? Yes, this is what he is talking about. And these were articles he wrote literally in the last 3-4 months. They were published before he left his body. And he sets there the framework of the next immediate step for humanity in order to be able to establish a divine life on earth. Even before the supramental consciousness is fully revealed, a part of our mind can open to its influence sufficiently. And this is a part of our physical mind, this rational thinking sense mind. A part of this can sufficiently open to the influence of the supramental that it can become sufficiently free of ignorance and to be an instrument of knowledge without ignorance. And it is this which he has described as the immediate next step for realizing a divine life on earth. Such a grade, as we can see from the logic which we discussed earlier, such a layer or a fine grade is certainly, even if it exists, has never been touched or developed in evolution. Sri Aurobindo developed it within his own consciousness and imprinted it into the mother's consciousness. And through her, as a potential or an active force in humanity, that if we prepare ourselves, then if we open to it, then this can begin to unveil in us and organize itself in us. And the stages of its organization he has described in this little booklet. But what is interesting is, in that organization, it can reflect, before it reflects the highest supermind, it can also begin to reflect intermediate gradations. So the mind of light proper does not belong to just a series of gradations. Rather, it is an instrument in which all these gradations can express themselves. So even in the unfolding of the mind of light, one can speak of several degrees of its unfolding, corresponding to these levels of consciousness. But essentially, it is the status of the physical mind itself opening to the spiritual consciousness and being able to be an instrument for it without being subject to ignorance. So it is not only a new step, but a new possibility in human evolution. In this text we have just read, he does not give any names to these higher planes. So the text itself applies to all the levels that are available, including the potential of the mind of light. So later, of course, he will speak of how even when we arrive to these planes, the mind still retains its limitation because these are operating inside the domain of the mind. And what is the chief limitation of the mind? It cuts up. So when through these possibilities, it looks at the divine consciousness and experiences the divine, it will still catch an aspect of the divine. And he'll describe those. And even when it develops the capacity to experience each of those separately, it will find it difficult to integrate them in a single experience. And that also he discusses. And the means then to complete that is the next chapter. We continue this next Friday.